And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part, I awakened my latent psychic abilities with smelling salts and also a pair of bongos I found in the trash. And in this part, I work on the update to combat inputs mechanics, and also a new weapon archetype, because I made 2 of them, and then I deleted one. The first thing I did was rework how weapon sheathing worked. If you recall from the past devlogs of yore, weapon sheathing worked as if you didn't have a weapon drawn, you would press your inputs and then you would pull your weapon out, and if you were putting your weapon away, your weapon would be put away and you would have regular movements. I then realized that that was really lame and boring and slow, so I removed that system entirely. The reason for this is I didn't want to be in a situation where the player is having to pull their weapon out to initiate combat and then being put in a slow movement state because they are holding a heavier weapon, and the player always optimally wanting their weapon to be put away when not in combat, but then when they're in combat they have really slow movements, and it really juxtaposes the fast movement of the game normally and your ability to do really quick speedy things with this really slow weapon movement. I think realistically what would be more fun is, even if you have a gigantic weapon the size of 2 people, you should just be able to move normally all the time, because it's more fun. If the player is always going to be sheathing their weapon to move normally, just have it always be sheath, which then that supplied me with the arduous task of having to find a solution for pulling out weapons whenever the character doesn't have a weapon, and not just reanimating everything for every individual weapon, because that would take too long, even for me. Crazy person who enjoys too much work. That's too much work. The reason for this is, if I have, for example, 5 different weapons, just for example, I would then have to have a unique animation for running with each of these weapons, idling with each of these weapons, wall running, ledge grabbing, swimming, crouching, etc. for each of these weapons. It would take too long, it wouldn't be interesting for me, and also it doesn't work with the secondary weapon mechanic that I added later. My solution for this was pretty weird, if I'm being honest, and I might change it in the future. The way I saw it, there was 2 solutions, one being that the player always has a weapon on a sheathed position, either at the hips or in their back or in their hand in some way, and then as the animation begins, it is just teleported into the player's hand, and the first animation has the hint of you drawing your weapon out. And then when each animation is finished, we have an animation for the player putting their weapon back. This wasn't fun at all, because it meant that each animation has to have a really slow start and a really slow finish, because the player always has to pull out and then put their weapon back, and it wasn't very fun to play. All of the attacks then felt very sluggish, because well, they're just a whole lot slower to start and slower to finish. I want quick attacks, and this general sort of system didn't work particularly well for accommodating for quick attack systems. So I pretty much just did the exact same thing, but I removed the hint of animation of pulling your weapon out and putting your weapon away, and now the weapons just warp from the player's back, for example, to the player's hand, for example, magically. This might look a bit silly in some instances, but I would rather have the sort of janky visual of a weapon just floating into the player's hand or appearing out of nowhere than the gameplay being bad. The way I see it, one of those is significantly worse than the other. I would rather have a weird looking visual than game not fun. However, there was two different ways of having the player have their weapon appear into their hands, and I picked the weirder option. The first option I had was the weapon disappears and reappears on the player's hand, and there is a visual effect of the weapon disappearing from the player's back and reappearing in the player's hand, sort of like a magical thing, like the weapon dissolves and then reappears in the player's hand. I quite like this system a lot, and I may change this system in the future to accommodate for this sort of visual change. But I had a stupider idea. What if, when you draw your weapon out, the weapon has its own state and will just move through game space and appear into the player's hand? This means there isn't any weapon disappearing, and the weapon just floats into your hand. I really like this setup. I know it looks really silly sometimes when the sword clips through the player's body to hit onto their back again, but I think it looks so silly, and it's fun, and if I'm being realistic, it's just 4 frames every time you draw and put away your weapon, so it's not a huge issue, but it's very wacky, and I quite like how this looks. The logic for this is pretty simple. Each weapon has its own position based on where it would be on the player's body when they're not using the weapon, and where the weapon would be on the player's body when they are using the weapon. And then at this point the weapon just shifts from one point to another as we use an attack and stop using an attack. We also adjust the rotation as this happens, so the weapon just organically moves through system space to be wherever it should be, and then it moves back. All this is to make it have slightly more visual appeal than the weapon disappearing and reappearing, but as I've said, this is a completely minor addition to the game's visual style, so it's whatever. The more important issue I had was that a lot of the weaponry that I am designing is very huge and bigger than the player, and if the weapon is on the player's back, then it may clip into the floor or just look kind of odd when the weapon is 3 times the size of the player. So to accommodate for this, I just made it so weapons have their own animation when sheathed and unsheathed, and these will usually shrink down the weapon or have them compacted in some way. The example I have currently is the Greatsword. It just slots into itself because it's a giant hunk of metal. The top half just smushes into the bottom half, and it shrinks the size of the Greatsword down considerably, so there isn't as much issue of clipping. When the player pulls out the weapon, this animation is reversed and the weapon pulls itself out of its sheathing and it extends. This also has more of a design principle too. It just kind of looks more interesting for weapons as they shift and change as you pull them out or put them back into the sheathing, but it's not a really complicated or major addition. It just kind of looks cool. Next, I worked on different weapon archetypes. The first one I tried this week was a glaive, which is like a spear with a sword on the end. I really like this weapon. I wanted the weapon design to be definitely something that wasn't a short sword, because I feel like usually in action games and RPGs and other such fantasy settings, short swords are completely overused. They're interesting, but they're sort of the very basic vanilla sort of weapon archetype, and I rarely ever use them in video games, so I would like for my game to just not have an option for a basic short sword, and for me to at least have some level of complexity or an idea that's more interesting than that. So I worked on a Glave moveset. You may be able to tell by the fact that none of the in-game visuals involved the Glave moveset that I didn't use this weapon. I started to animate a few of the weapons with the old sheathing technique of the weapon always being pulled out and put away at the end of each animation, and I didn't like this and I changed this, but I also felt like maybe a glaive was not a very good starting weapon for a moveset to design for. It's a very complicated weapon to animate for, and I would probably get back to what the glaive animates as in the future. But I animated 3 different light attacks for the glaive. These are just your general slashing for the light attack 1. You pull the weapon out, you slash, you put the weapon away. Light attack 2 is pretty fun. You follow up from this, you spin the glaive in the air and you slam down with it. I very much like this aspect of the glaive, that it's more of like a agile spinning weapon. It makes the animations definitely fun to do and interesting to boot. And the third animation is one that is completely unfinished, but it is following up from the second animation. You're pulling the weapon back, you're swinging forward, and then you're falling through this way to pull the glaive above you, and then you're slamming down with it and slashing again. In the future, when I actually add the glaive, this is definitely more of the moveset I want to encompass with the glaive. Just a lot of spinning, a lot of slashing, a very dynamic, fast moveset, but I would rather have the game be more designed and fleshed out before I add a weapon with such level of complexity as the glaive, because it's a little complex. The next thing I did was work on the complexity of combat. I will keep this section short, so only 10 minutes long, because I haven't really finished the setup. But the way it works now is that combat has a primary and a secondary weapon, and the reason I can't particularly show this off is because I haven't programmed any secondary weapons yet. The way that combat worked before is that you had a light and a heavy button. I've now reworked that so you have a melee and a ranged button, the ranged button being your secondary weapon, so you press your melee input and you will use your melee attack, you press your ranged input, you will swap to your ranged weapon and use a ranged weapon attack. This is for two reasons. This is to make complex combat more complex, but also to make it easier for the player. The way it worked before is that you had a light and a heavy attack. The issue with this was a lot of attacks I felt like were getting to the point where attacks were just button combos. For example, if I want to do this sort of attack, I have to press X, X, Y, Y, X, and that will make that attack, or I have to press X, 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 Y, or you would just have the rhythm of your button inputs. And the issue with that is that if you wanted to perform a certain move, like for example if you wanted to perform a heavy launcher or a specific type of launcher or anything like that, you would have to use a normal attack and then go into your jump inputs. And the reason for this, changing it, is that that sort of combat wasn't very easy for the player, and I also felt like it wasn't very good for complex combats, because you're still being forced to having to do these rhythm-based combat inputs in order to do the moves that you want to press, when in actuality what would be a lot more fun and engaging for the player is if they can press the majority of their combat attacks at any point, just with specific button input presses. And also with a light and a heavy input, it meant that a lot of combat attacks were just going to be too complex to the point where players weren't going to organically want to do those attacks, or if they did want to do specific attacks at the end of attack strings, they would have to be pressing so many inputs that it would just get boring and it wouldn't be very engaging to do. You'd be more focused on what buttons you are pressing in what order, in opposed to thinking, well, this is what the enemy is doing, I should use this setup of an attack, because if you have to navigate a bunch of button inputs to perform said attacks, then it's not very fun. So essentially the way combat works now is that you have your attack combos for just pressing your attack normally. This is just hammering it down on one input, but then if you move your stick in certain directions and press an input, or press an input while jumping or in certain states, you will automatically transition into any specific attack for those inputs. For example, if you pressed a normal melee attack, you would do your melee attack strings, but if you were holding backwards away from the enemy while pressing this input string, you would initiate a completely different attack. I then worked on the inputs for your great attacks. These are just the light attack combo or your melee attack combo, so you're just pressing the weapon normally. Right now I only have the on ground melee combo and in air melee combo, so none of these attacks have complexity to them. This is just you pressing the inputs. Going over the animations incredibly quickly, I hope. The first attack swing you have is a big overhead slash. This is just your, or more of an overhead slam. This is you slamming your weapon into enemies. The next attack, which is probably one of the more complicated ones, and it doesn't really come across in animation form, but is you hammering down your weapon into the ground and vaulting over it. Since you're being moved in system space based on the input velocity of the weapon, this is actually going to move your character across as they are vaulting, so it doesn't really come across very well or read very well in Blender, but in Unity I think it's a-okay. You land on the ground after this vault. Well, you position the weapon in midair to slash down, so this is another slam attack. The follow-up for this is a slash, and then you're spinning your character around with your momentum to do a second slash. So the second input is 2 slashes, and then the final input is you charging forward with your weapon and then thrusting your weapon into the air. This one has damaging frames as you are charging and then resetting and also launching into the air. So if you hit an enemy once with the charge, you will push them along, and then your hit collision will reset and you'll push them into the air. These also loop into each other, as you can probably see as they're playing right now. So you can just hammer down the this attack combo infinitely if you really want to. The whole point of this attack combo is to really show off how heavy the Greatsword is. So these are a lot of high damaging attacks, but they're also very slow. Because it's a giant hunk of metal that you're swinging around wildly. Overall, I think these animations for the combat of the Greatsword is pretty good, just as your basic attack string. I think the second one, where you vault your character into the air, may be a bit confusing or difficult for players, so I may rework that into more of a traditional twisting the weapon around and slashing the enemy with your weapon. I'm not particularly sure currently what to do with that attack animation, but I do think it is very stylish and it does look nice, so I may keep it. A lot of these attacks are just pushing the enemy back as you use them, so the logic for these attacks is pretty simple. They're just high damaging, smashing attacks to normally do damage to enemies. The point of the Greatsword is that it's more for bosses or slower enemies. It's not very good in groups, despite the fact that in these videos I'm hitting a group of enemies. It's not very good for normal enemies because it's very slow unless you really time it out. It's that sort of weapon. It's high damaged, but you really have to time your hits very well because there's a lot of frames of these animations where you're left open and you're recoiling, and there's also a very slow startup to each of these animations. I then worked on the animation for the light air combo. This is just you pressing your regular inputs when in midair with your weaponry without any alternate states of your character. This is just a slash downwards, a slash left, and a slash right, which then goes back into a pose that transitions into the slash downwards. So this is another looping animation. While it doesn't loop perfectly like the original slash animation, it has blending applied in engine, so it looks a whole lot smoother. But this is basically just an attack you can continue to press in midair if you want to do your attacks in midair, and unless you hit the ground, this isn't going to stop. This one was fun to animate. It was also a lot easier to animate because I didn't have to adjust for the player's foot or really any logical motion, since they're in the middle of the air and they're attacking. It's just sort of the cartoony action game. You attack in midair, you defy gravity. So a lot of the motion and push of the character, I can just sort of have them float about in midair and carry through their momentum as they are slashing in midair, and I don't need to adjust for foot placement or anything complicated, which is a whole lot easier. Despite the visuals of the attack animations, these are all just regular knockbacks and push animations in terms of logical force movements. So the first animation, slamming downwards, will not actually spike enemies that are in midair downwards. You would have a specific attack input for this. The reason for that is because this is your first midair attack combo. If the first attack combo did spike enemies down in midair, if you were attacking enemies in midair that you were juggled, or that you had launched into the air and you wanted to juggle, it would be incredibly complicated because you would just hit them onto the ground again. So all of these attacks just knock the enemy around if they're in midair. These are just extending your regular midair juggles if you have got the enemy to be in midair. In terms of in-game logic, these attacks are, both attack combos are just for hitting the enemy regularly. There's no fancy tricks with these attacks, there's no launchers, slams, stunners, things of that nature. These are just your regular base attacks if you want to attack the enemy quickly and you don't want to do any fancy inputs. If you're a good player, if you're skilled and you want to have your triple S combo ranking eternally etched onto your game screen, then you will never see these attack animations, because you will always be doing the cool attack combos, like backwards, left, forwards to do your spin sling attack. These are just the regular attacks that need to be in the game for the game to work. The model for the Greatsword is a big hunk of metal. I really like the design for the Greatsword. I really like weapon designs, but I don't really have a huge amount of experience making them, so this one was pretty fun to do. I think it turned out quite well. Usually I would prefer for the weapons to look more fantasy and exaggerated and silly, so I may change this weapon so it has some more exaggerated silly weapon aesthetic choices to it, but right now I kind of like it. It has the animated setup where it can slot into itself. It has some gaps in the top where there's just holes in the weapon for some reason. I'm going to say from a lore perspective, aerodynamics, but I'm almost positive that that would be a terrible idea for an actual weapon. It has ridges at the bottom. It's just overall a very nice looking weapon design. I'm pretty happy with how it looks, and it also looks pretty good in engine as you swing your weapon around. I then added a double jump option. The reason for adding this option is, once again, I was playing a popular action game that you could absolutely definitely guess as to what the game is at this point, and I realized that as I was playing this game, and really most action games in general, I have this odd habit of always wanting to be in midair when fighting, and every single time my player character is on the ground when I am playing an action game, I am seething with rage and I just want to be in the air again. So I feel like adding more aerial movement options into my game so you can more easily stay in the air. So now there is a double jump. The animation for this is a backflip, which I think actually looks pretty nice. There's no real logic for why the character can double jump. There's no jet boost, there's no magical double jumping effect. You kind of just do it and your character double jumps, which I'm completely fine with. I think double jumps don't really need an explanation in game, especially if the game is already exaggerated and silly. You kind of just assume that the character can do that. This is very good for keeping your character in air, and it's also very good in air mobility option. For example, you can dash in air, and at the end of your dash or the end of your aerial dodge, you can jump out of it, landing into a double jump, and then from this double jump you can dash out of that. So that's a more complicated aerial mobility option for the double jump. It allows your character to have more mobility in air and do more options in air, have more aerial maneuverability, and stay in the air for longer. At this point I will add a combo meter in my game that only ticks up when you're in the air. The only way to get the sickest combo in my action game is by never touching the floor. I then added a system for input saving. This is for more complicated attacks that I'm going to use in the future, and there is no way to visualize this, so I will keep it once again very short. All this is a list that is generated whenever the player makes an input. We will then check when the last input was made, and we will maintain a list of all your saved player inputs. So if we are pressing forwards and then backwards and then forwards again, this list will read forwards, back, forwards, and we will then be able to reasonably deduce that the player was making such an input, and they would, if an attack had that input required for the attack, we would be able to perform it. This is essentially to allow me to make a very complicated attack input system, so basically I'll be able to read if the player had pressed back and then forward or something like that. This list then clears automatically based on how long the input was made. If the input was made half a second ago, we will remove the input from our list because it's no longer needed, and then when checking this list we will check for the order inputs were made. So if you pressed backwards and then left and then forwards, we will be able to see that we pressed forwards and then before that left and then backwards, so this wouldn't trigger any inputs attack that is made from pressing backwards and then forwards, because we can read that the player had made another input after pressing backwards. This is just future-proofing for more complicated combat in the future. And that is it for this devlog. I had a development week of doing a bunch of different things because I wasn't particularly sure on the moveset I wanted to implement this week. I was very unsure on if I wanted to use a Greatsword or if I wanted to use the Glave or a different sort of weapon, so I ended up making a lot of animations and experimenting around with weapon combos. I do still think that maybe using the Greatsword as my initial design weapon was maybe not the best idea, because I wanted to make sure the game's combat worked with the speed of the movement in game, and maybe choosing the second slowest weapon to design first was a bad idea. But I think it ended out pretty good. I'm happy with the animations I have for the Greatsword. The moveset is pretty satisfying and fun so far, so I'm excited to design more for the Greatsword. Next week of development, I hope to more flesh out the moveset of the weaponry, even though I always say that in the end of devlogs and then I work on a completely different system. But this time I do actually want to work on the complexity of weapons in the next devlog. So next time, hopefully, the Greatsword will have a complicated moveset where you can do a bunch of different things with different weapon inputs. Or maybe I will work on the logic for your secondary weapon. Who is to say?